we moved, my mother and father and myself, being an only child, we moved to Carrollton on January 1st, 1937. Now, that having been said, uh, we lived in what is now within the Carrollton city limits. We lived over on Marsh Lane. My father had a 117-acre farm or ranch, whatever you want to call it, on Marsh Lane, just north of Beltline, about a half a mile. So is now in Carrollton. So we were attuned to Carrollton. We came to church in Carrollton. We shopped in Carrollton. My dad had a butcher shop in Carrollton at one time. So we were tied into Carrollton for many years. Carrollton was the place we knew people, and we almost felt we lived there, but we lived out on Marsh Lane. Well, he was a farmer and a rancher. We had about half the property was in cultivation, and we raised corn and wheat and oats, and sometimes cotton. Then the rest of it was in grass and so on. My dad, he was a trader. He was always trading horses, and horses not too much, but he traded cattle and sheep. He was a big sheep operator. And he would buy and sell sheep, and he'd buy them from neighbors and so on, and then he'd take them to Fort Worth and take them to the stockyards over there. And I've gone over there with him. He had always had a trailer he was pulling behind his car, and he'd talk to the neighbors and so on. If they had something to sell, he'd buy it, and then he'd stock them in our place for a while, and then he'd take them over to Fort Worth. And so I made many trips to Fort Worth with sheep and also cattle, more sheep than anything else. But the sheep operation there's a spine road that's still there, runs in front of the old commission house there, commission building, and the sheep was on the south side of that road, cattle was on the north side of it. And it was interesting to note that the way they controlled the sheep was with goats. They had some great big old, I guess they were Spanish goats that they kept in the stockyard there, and these old goats seemed to know they could herd them around. And sheep will follow anything, and they'd follow these goats, and that's the way they controlled the sheep and drove them around from pen to pen to pen. He had a butcher shop on the north side of the square for some period of time. I don't know how I don't remember how they got the meat that they sold. I think my dad probably had it slaughtered somewhere around there. And he ran that for a good number of years. I just remember we always ate meat pretty good because he had access to the meat market there. I was born on Marsh Lane. My grandfather came into the area here sometime after 1850. And I don't know the exact time, but their home place was on what is now Midway Road. It was called Dooley Road at the time. They were right directly across from where the control tower is for Addison Airport. That was a Foster home place there, and that was sometime after 1850. My grandfather was in the Confederate Army for a period of time, and I still have his papers where he joined, and they paid him so much for his horse and his saddle. So his horse and saddle was probably worth more than he was. and he was a prisoner of war for a period of time. And I think I have maybe some records of that, but I don't remember anything about it. But I know he was a prisoner of war, and I remember when they released him, and they had to sign all kinds of papers and so on that they wouldn't pick up arms anymore and all that. So, but other than that, I don't know much about it. But then, like I say, the Fosters were here from 1860 on. Several things I remember, they would pay the farmers to ply up their cotton, and I remember that. I remember one day at my uncle's place. My uncle lived on his name was W.B. Foster, and he lived on the old Foster home place. It was a great big old two-story rambling type house, and I remember I was up there, and I remember seeing them plow up the cotton. Also, they had a program where they were trying to get beef off the market to raise the prices. It was almost nothing per pound, and so they had a program, and I don't remember exactly how it worked, but I know how it worked on the principal end of it. You'd take your cattle down to a place in Fair Park. It was right across the street. Now there's the agricultural buildings there where they have sheep and goats and cattle and all that sort of stuff back in there, and they would take the cattle down there and they would slaughter them right there on the spot. And the other thing I remember was my dad had an account in the bank in Addison, and that building still stands. It in the area of Addison, which is on Addison, just right at the railroad tracks, and at Addison Road, the building that was the bank building is still there, and it is the only original building that was there in that time period that still exists. Now, everything else has been built on either side of that bank, but the bank building is the original building. But I remember my dad coming home one day and telling my mother, said, well, we've lost all our money in the bank. The bank is closed, and we don't know if it'll open or when it'll open and so on. And that was, I remember that very, very distinctly. And I don't know what the outcome of that was. I assume the bank opened. I really don't know, but I remember he was concerned that he'd lost whatever money he had in that bank. And the money was just almost non-existent. Everybody, of course, we didn't have any trouble eating because we had, we had cows, and so we had milk and butter, and my mother raised chickens, and she would trade eggs, take the eggs into Carrollton and swap the eggs and the butter. She would carry butter in also, and she'd swap those two items for whatever we needed, flour and whatever canned goods and so on. But so we ate good, and then we met my uncle who lived over on Dooley Road, or what is now Midway. My dad hated hogs. He wouldn't have them on our place, but he conned my uncle into raising hogs. So they always slaughtered hogs, and they had a building that they would pack the hams and the shoulders and the bellies of them in salt and so on. and my uncle also had a corrugated metal building that he would build a fire in and smoke hams and shoulders. And I guess I can't remember whether he smoked the sides or not. Probably didn't. But so we had access to a lot of meat, and so we didn't suffer for being hungry like a lot of people did. But it was a tough time, It just and I remember at Christmas time there was a guy that was in business. I can't remember his name, but he had a shoe store, big shoe store, on Elm Street, just above Lamar, and he'd give away shoes at Christmas time, and I remember all the colored folk from our place north all the way to what is now Trinity Mills was populated by colored folks. So all of our neighbors, except the Hughes family on the south of us, were black people, and they'd all go into Dallas and get shoes from this place. I remember, and he did that every year that I remember during the Christmas season, during the Depression. Well, a lot of some of the guys were going away, and it was just a difficult and different time because with the guys going away, all the young guys were joining the Air Force or Army or Navy or Marines or Coast Guard or whatever. So then that left the stores and so on using elderly people or whoever they could lay their hands on to operate. And we didn't have too many guys that got killed. I don't know, probably in the immediate area, maybe a half a dozen or something like that. Not a big number of people guys that didn't come back. You had to be 7 by September 1st to start in the first grade. Well, I wasn't 7 until November the 5th. So, and there were a bunch of us that were in that category, and there was a lady, Mrs. DeCan, who started a little private school that catered to our little group. I think there were 8 of us that went to private school for the first grade. And then after that, I went to public school for second grade on. We went in the old red brick building. It was a 3-story. Well, the first story was partially submerged, but then it had the second and third story. It had all the grade schools and the high school in that building. Turned out my uncle was the general contractor on that building, and his contract price was $12,500. And I remember him telling me about that. He said, I made money on that. So it shows the difference in cost of that day and now. But the church, the building, of course, had no air conditioning, and it was heated by coal. And they'd have a big pile of coal out in the side yard. The restrooms were outside. There was a separate building for restrooms, and we to get it to be the coal guy for the day. We'd go out and get coal. That was kind of sought after because you could get out there and mess around for a while. But that's the way it was heated, so it wasn't very efficient. It was either hot or cold or sometimes in between. I graduated in 1939. We had 50, 55, something like that. And I have kept up with a lot of the kids. They were a lot of them, stayed around the area, and I only know for sure of four. There are three guys and one girl that I know for sure are still alive. There may be more, but I know of four. And I have one guy that lives up on Legacy in Plano that I see all the time, and he and I talk 2 or 3 times a week. But it's gotten down to pretty few. An interesting thing I had last fall, the Carrollton school system decided they would honor, maybe that's not introduce the ones that had graduated from whatever high school. It was known as Carrollton High School, and then after that Turner, and then I don't know how many high schools they've got now. But at any rate, they started introducing by decade the current graduates that are most current. And then they got down to the 50s and the 40s, and when they got to the 30s, I was the only guy standing, and that was kind of fun. My 2 daughters were with me, and we had a good time with that. There was a skating rink that one of the mobile type skating rinks that just south of the square, and we all took part in that, and we did a lot during the summertime. We did a lot of skinny dipping in the gravel pits west of Carrollton, because the pits were they flooded, and so they'd be full, and so we had access to that. The people that ran some of the gravel pits were still active, but the guys that ran it, as long as we didn't mess with their equipment, they didn't care. So we did a lot of that. And also, Sandy Lake was not the way it is now. And that's kind of an interesting story also. Would you like me to expand on that? Well, it was on, I don't know how many acres they had, but most of it was land that had been already mined for gravel and so on. And but there was a big old 2-story house on what was Beltline Road then. This property was owned by a McLean family, and they lived in Dallas, but they had a son. It was Sammy McLean. Well, old Sammy was an alcoholic, and I think they just put him out there in that place to keep him kind of hid from the family. I don't really know, but anyway, they funded him every month. Well, needless to say, when he got his funding, until he ran out of money, he was drunk. So that that went on before the war. It turned out some way, somehow, when the National Guard was activated, Sammy got activated with the National Guard. How he ever got sober enough to get in, nobody knows, but he did. And in the process, he served in the National Guard during the war. Well, during the process, he got involved with Alcoholics Anonymous and got clean. And when he was discharged after the war, he stayed clean. I mean, he got off the booze and started dealing with alcoholics. And he'd take them, and he had this big old house out there. Well, he'd bring these alcoholics out there and dry them out and so on. And that's the way Sandy Lake, the pool, got made. He used all this free labor that he had, keeping these guys busy and keeping them away from the booze and so on. So that was the initial Sandy Lake swimming pool, and it was done with the alcoholics' labor, which was kind of interesting. We always had a big carnival during the fall, and the Lions Club sponsored that, and it was just the focal point of everything, all the merchants and so on. They had for many years they'd have drawings and so on. So when you bought groceries, well, you'd get tickets, and then they got put in this big old drum they had, and they'd be every Saturday there'd be a big drawing, and it was really big. People really went to those things then. Of course, money was scarce, and whatever, if you get a few bucks, for in this drawing. And my gosh, on Saturday afternoon, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of people coming to town, and they'd all be there when these drawings took place. And that went on for a long, long time. Well, I worked at the A&P store. There was a A&P store that was on the north side of the square, right in the middle of the buildings there, and there was always two other grocery stores. There was one on the north side. There was Dickerson's Grocery, and then there was a Perry's Grocery, and then there was another one that was, I can't remember the name of it. I don't know, but there were always three grocery stores on the square. And there were two dry goods stores. There were two drug stores. One on the north side, Jim Perry ran that, and the one on the east side, it always had a good soda fountain, and everybody went there. Frank Good ran that one. He ran it for many, many years. Jim Perry died, and it was operated by several people over the years. Roy McCormick finally got a hold of it. This was in the late 37, 38, 39, when I was going to high school. After the war, things began to grow, and things began to disperse from the square. You just couldn't get all of the A&P store and Godfrey's department store moved behind on the north side of the square. Much larger buildings, and so that kind of started the demise of the square. It's still maintained, though, the goods pharmacy, because everybody recognized old Frank Good. If you got sick, you'd go to Frank, and he'd treat you until you either got well or got worse and went to the doctor. So everybody recognized that he was, he knew what he was doing. Well, the ice house was owned by back at when my remembrance of it. Was owned by a guy named Shorty Morrison, and the guy that delivered, they had a little delivery wagon, and Shorty had a team of miniature mules that pulled this wagon, so it went all over town, and everybody. Of course, a few people began to have electric refrigerators then, but still, I remember when we came to Carrollton in '37, we still had an ice box, and got ice from off the wagon. The only thing I remember, it was a center for watermelons. They always stored watermelons in the ice house, so you could always go to the ice house and get ice cold watermelons. I don't remember anything else that they sold out of it. I don't think they sold drinks or anything. Not, I don't remember that if they did, but I remember they were big in watermelons. And people would buy them, and a lot of times they'd buy them and they'd get out behind the stores and cut them and eat the watermelons and just leave the rinds there. And another thing they would do, if you had a half of these were, pretty big watermelons. They weigh 35 pounds or so, and they still had little Model T Fords. And these kids would get one of these watermelon rinds and go lift one of the rear wheel on the old Model Ts and put it down in that. So when the guy came to go, his wheel was spinning that watermelon rind. Yeah, it was great fun. Well, it was all volunteered, and I have a picture in this booklet here that I have, and I can. There were probably 25 guys or so, and I can name all of them except two of the guys. I can't put name. I knew them, but I can't put a name with them. But they were always a good, well-run organization. They all took great pride in their fire department, and they would have. Remember, they'd have contests. Foot races and races to connect the hoses up and that sort of thing between other fire departments in there, Richardson and Plano and I guess maybe Louisville, but they'd have fairly regularly would have contests like that. And then I don't know, in the 50s, I guess late 50s, they began to go away. They still had the volunteer department, but there were some paid employees that stayed on duty all the time. One of the things I remember, they would go out of the city with their fire trucks and so on. If someone had a house on fire over toward Addison or up toward what's Frisco now, they'd go quite a ways out in the country, several miles, to fight the fire. And I remember my first house when I came back from the service was up on the hill across from what was the old high school. And if the truck came along, they'd always sound the siren to wake everybody up at night. And if the truck went out on Belline Road East, there'd be a great line of cars following, me included, to watch them fight the fire. So that was great fun. They finally stopped that because it would get in the way. But we did it for a long time. Well, there wasn't much of a police force. They had a town marshal that was hired by the city. Well, and there was the town. He was called a town marshal, and there was just one guy, and that was. It was a guy named Charlie Chastain, and Charlie was kind of the guy that he kind of ran the city. He knew he was in the charge of the water system, and he was the town marshal. And then they kind of separated that, and I guess Charlie was still pretty much in charge of the water system. Then there was another guy named Hobby James, and he was the town marshal for a while. Then they did away with that, and then it got into more of a professional deal. And then they established the constables, and they kind of were the law in the area and so on. And also the sheriff sheriff's department was always recognized in the area. The sheriff would I mean, spend time, and I remember in the fall when we would have our carnival. The sheriff would always come out, and he'd mingle with the people, and so everybody knew him by the first name, and he knew a lot of the people. He and there was a guy named Bill Decker. He was a long time. What did they call him? He, for all practical purposes, ran the sheriff's department. Then he ultimately became sheriff. He was highly respected by both the criminal element and the good guys. He'd walk into situations where there'd be a guy holed up, and he could walk in and talk to the guy, and the guy that was causing trouble knew Bill, knew that he wouldn't tell him anything that wasn't true, and he'd walk him out. He was really a good sheriff back for those times. I don't know how well he'd do now, but I remember my dad when we lived out on the farm before we moved into Carrollton. As I was saying earlier, all the neighbors to the north of us were black, and they all knew that if they got in trouble, if they didn't kill somebody, if they just got in fights or whatever, if they hadn't done anything too bad, my dad could go down and get them out of jail, because he knew this guy Bill Decker, and he'd turn them over to my dad, and and my dad would tell him, now look, you got to straighten up, because I ain't going to come down and get you anymore. So that worked pretty good. They were a very peaceful bunch that never had any trouble. They were all hard-working people, but they knew if they got in trouble, my dad could get them out of jail if they hadn't killed somebody. It was starting to rain, as I remembered. We went to a show in Dallas, and when we came back to Carrollton 9 o'clock or so on Sunday evening, water was, it was still raining. I mean, just raining very hard, so we knew that something was going to happen. And there was some water in town, so we decided that for some strange reason we'd drive out east of Carrollton and see what was going on out toward Addison and so on. Well, that wasn't a very wise move, because it kept raining, and by the time we made we went out Beltline, and then we came back down through Farmers Branch. Well, by then you couldn't get back to Carrollton. It was all flooded. So, of course, her folks didn't know where we were, and my mother didn't know where I was. I guess my mother was more used to it, because a lot of times she didn't know where I was. But anyway, it was, I don't know, it was 11 o'clock or so before we got back. I don't think we got back in. My mother lived on what was College Avenue, and that was our Beltline Road. And I got back to the hill, off the hill, and stopped there and walked down to where my mother lived, and got her out, and where they were had opened the school up on the hill where people could be safe and so on. And so I carried her up there. The water didn't get in her house, but it got up within a few inches of getting in her house. So I got her out, and I remember it flooded, a lot of the stores in downtown Carrollton, and they were days and days and days trying to get the water pumped out from underneath the buildings and all that. Then the second one was in 1949. By that time, I had built a house up on the hill, and my wife and I had. She worked for Pontiac Division of General Motors, and we had gotten a new 1949 Pontiac Streamliner. And, I mean, it started raining just like it did in 42, and rain, so we knew that there was going to be a flood. So I remember I drove my car. I wasn't going to drive it down in that water. I drove it down as far as I could. And went down and got my mother out, and we carried her up to our house, which was on high land. Same kind of thing. Everything was, in the downtown square area was pretty well damaged and so on. So there was a lot of work to be done and so on. We went to the Methodist church, and I had some people there that were my teachers and so on. There was Mr. Squibb, W.T. Squibb, and Miss Marion Good, and the Godfreys, who ran one of the stores there. Dry goods. They were called dry goods store back in those days. And those people, the Rotons, I knew the Roten family. They were people that were always involved in anything that was good in the community. They were always involved in it. The Rotens, an interesting thing about the Roten family, a guy named Holman Roten. He was the old man and old lady had two children, Iris and Holman. Well, Holman started a funeral home in the back of the store. Now, the store was on the west side of the square there, and that's where the embalming took place. And he had a good number of caskets in there that you could decide on and so on. So. But that was the beginning of the Roten funeral home, and everything that happened in the back of the store there. They had curtains that they pulled that shielded all that stuff, all that apparatus and so on, and the caskets from the dry goods operation. So. Well, that was kind of an interesting thing. Holman really wanted to go into the service. I guess he'd been in the ROTC. Don't know, but at any rate, he mobilized with the National Guard, but he'd had a wreck. He was coming through Farmers Branch on, I don't remember what it was called then, but at any rate, you had to make a little curve as you're coming into Farmers Branch. Well, I don't know whether Holman had been drinking or what, but at any rate, he didn't make the curve, and he ran off the road and ran down into this ravine. So, it broke both of his legs. Well, apparently they didn't do too good a job setting him, so he got discharged from the service shortly after he'd gotten in. I remember he came walking. I don't know where he started from. I guess downtown, but he'd walked all the way out to Carrollton on his bad legs. But that's how he got out of the service. And then he started the funeral home in the back of the store, and then ultimately he moved out and they developed a going business that ran it still goes under the name, but he's been dead a good number of years. But he was a good guy. All the stuff that went on, you knew, because I worked in an A&P store, and it was kind of the manager was a fairly young guy, and our store was always the center of all the devilment that went on. I remember we used to, one of the things we'd do on during the week when we wasn't going to hurt anybody, we'd go out and take a big old Irish potato and put on the exhaust pipe. Well, if you didn't blow up the muffler, that thing would blow off, So that was always fun, and there was always just some kind of devilment going on, and anything of that nature that went on. Our bunch, our guys did it, me included. So we had a lot of fun. It was just a good time. You got to know people. I knew, 'cause people we bought eggs, we bought butter, we bought pecans. So we got to know. I knew everybody within a 4 or 5 mile radius around. I knew who they were, where they lived, what they did, how reliable they were, whether or not they'd cheat you. People would bring in eggs that were not good, and so we had to candle all the eggs. Well, there were some people that I knew to candle 100% of their eggs. So they wouldn't hesitate to bring in eggs that were bad. Others, you knew you didn't have to candle theirs because their eggs were always good. So you learned a lot about people, and you learned people that you could take their checks. I remember we had one lady that they would come out on the weekends, and she'd always come in our store on Friday. They'd come out several times a month. Well, 100% of the time, that whatever the check she gave you was going to be hot, and we knew it. But the guy, it was I don't know what you call it, but she was the opposite of kleptomaniac, I guess, because she wouldn't hesitate to write you a hot check. She always had a story, but her husband would come in the next time they're in and say, "Well, what kind of check have we got hot this time?" And he'd make it good, and we knew that was going to happen 100% of the time. She never gave us a good check, and why, I don't know. It was just something that she did. So you learn to all kinds of things about people, who you could trust, who you couldn't, and it was a real training experience for me in living and dealing with people. I got enormous benefits that's helped me all of my life from the dealings that I got in working in that store, by getting to know people and how to judge them and so on. It's been very valuable to me, and I miss that. Well, we bought a lot. We were big dealers, and pecans were a big deal, and there's a lot of pecan trees between the Carrollton and the river and so on, and we bought thousands of pounds of pecans paid most of the time. In those days, we paid a nickel a pound for them. During the Depression era, I remember the MK&T. I guess that's the one that runs just on the east side of the square. They were there were a lot of trains coming through in those days, and they all seemed to have coal cars on them. These coal cars would be full of people that were just going somewhere. They didn't know where they were going. I guess they didn't care. But I remember we'd hear the train coming, and we'd throw rocks at these guys, and they'd throw coal back at us. And that one, what we got out of that, I don't know. But that was if we on Saturday when there were kids around and so on, not going to school. That was one of the things that happened. But they were always, I can remember those guys in those coal cars. And, of course, my mother lived, I lived with her. My father died the year I graduated from high school. There were always people, when these trains would stop, then the guys would offload, and they were hungry, and they'd fan out through the town. And my mother, since we were close, they'd come up the alley, and they'd knock on the back door and want to know if they could get any food. My mother always never let a guy go by that she didn't feed him. And I always thought they must have had our house marked because they were. And it just happened every day. But these guys would get off these trains, or if the trains were moving, sometime they'd jump off. But they were always in these coal cars, and sometimes they'd be 20 or 30 guys in a coal car. So it was a bad time in our country. It's just hard to say anything that ties what was in the past and what's going on now. I just can't get over the size of the city. And back in the 30s, we never even dreamed of the city being the size it is now. What is the population of Carrollton now?
120,000.
120,000, yeah. It was when we moved here in 1937. I don't know, maybe 1,000 people in Carrollton, maybe, but not many more than that, for sure.